All right, and we are live right at the end of the final regular season day, Sunday. Almost all games, I believe, are over. Seeding is set, and the postseason is on the horizon with the wild card round starting on Tuesday. But last episode we talked a bunch about the regular season, kind of what the MLB wanted, the numbers behind it, attendance, all that, and the new rules. But now it's finally over. And now we're getting to the October postseason, the time all baseball fans are waiting for. Got a lot of surprising teams that made it this year. We had a lot of surprising finishes. Some teams on the outside looking in, who we'll talk about in just a minute. But kind of just going off the last episode, Jake, honestly, this regular season, probably one of the most exciting ones that I've had in
Yeah,
recent memory, just because of a lot of teams and stuff. But I want to get your opinion again, just briefly on it.
hey man, it's fun. We talked about it last time. It's not often you come down to the last day. I mean, nothing was. Some things were said. Most things weren't set until a couple hours ago. Until Miami wins and the Cubs lose. Like we'll talk about that later. But yeah, man, it's just exciting to see teams. It's ever since we talked about it, ever since 2020 when they let more teams in. But just looking at the teams of the last few years, like that Nationals team, the Phillies last year that made the run, I feel like a lot more teams are more invested because they believe they can actually make a run to the postseason, which is good for the future of the league. I think we're seeing it now, definitely with teams like the Marlins, who nobody thought would be in the postseason race. I mean, we can talk about the Orioles. I'm sure we will. Nobody thought they were going to make the postseason, and now they're the number one seed in the AL. Yeah, it's just nice to see disparity between the top teams in the league, and it's going to be really exciting with these short series here coming up in next week's.
Yeah, you mentioned like we talked about him a bunch the past couple of episodes, but the probably the biggest surprise, not to me per se, but to Vegas and a lot of the media, was the Orioles. I went back and checked. I think DraftKings had their sports book. They had them over under 78.5 wins, which is very surprising because the year before they had 85. So you would think they would build off that and then make the playoffs, maybe. 100-win season and winning the division, especially off the start the Rays had. That was one of the best storylines to watch this year. Just kind of like how you said, but I feel like because of the added wild card to each league, it kind of gives other teams a chance. Some that you wouldn't think about. And we had a lot of that in the National League, some of it in the American League, but the National League is where it was really interesting, where we had a lot of teams that we definitely didn't think that they were going to be involved in anything postseason. I mean, the Marlins made it. But I didn't think they were going to make it this year. The Reds pretty much got eliminated to the second to last day of the season. I can bet you nobody said that was going to happen this year. Um, and that's I think that's good for baseball. I mean, sometimes you look at the playoffs and like the NBA, it feels like there's too many teams that make it, so the regular season doesn't have a huge impact. But I think baseball's kind of like they got the perfect
Right.
rhythm now with the right amount of teams. I think the regular season's still a good amount of games, and getting the postseason. I think the World Series, the latest game it goes is somewhere like November 5th or 6th, which is a little late, but it is what it is. So, but yeah, it was definitely a great regular season. I'm glad that most games were played. At least the Marlins don't have to play tomorrow's game
Right. That
from
was
that rain out in New York. But yeah, it was a great season, up and down. Teams that were overperformed, underperformed, in between. But we had pretty much everything this year. And then with the rule changes, um, it was a nice refresh. And
yeah.
I think this season more and more fans got involved, especially with the newer teams that are in the playoffs this year. So, but yeah. So, anything to add to that, or
Yeah, I mean, before we get in the postseason, I like how you talked about that. It's fun. I like the emphasis. Obviously, we talked about the rule changes last episode, so I'm not gonna talk about it a lot. But it seemed like the emphasis is on personality now. It's being yourself, marketing, celebrations, all these young kids that we see coming up. really being pushed by the MLB to be, the next wave of guys to get that next generation in. It's just nice to see that, man. It's nice to see people having, not being tight over swinging 3-0 down a bunch of runs and shit like Tony La Russa and all that. It's just nice to see that. And I'm sure it'll continue into the postseason. So like you said, it's going to be real fun, man. We got some exciting teams coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, the postseason's fun. It's great, but there's the teams that miss the playoffs. That some teams they're rebuilding, or they're not in the year where they think they're going to be in the playoffs.
Right.
And when you get to this time of the year, it's kind of sad for those fans, because then they don't get to experience the postseason throw for their teams. But as you can see on the side, is we have two teams that had some expectations this year and ended up falling just short, and both of them did it in different ways. And I'm talking about the Cubs and the Mariners, who were both eliminated yesterday, setting up the finalized wild cards for both leagues. Um, I'm interested to see one of two questions. Which one is more disappointing, is what I'll ask you first, between the Cubs and the Mariners.
Do you mean personally or for them? Because that's two completely different answers.
I would say for them.
For them, I think it has to be the Cubs, just because they were in a good spot most of the year. The Mariners, we watched it. I think it was probably around when we started the podcast, maybe a couple episodes ago. But when the Mariners went on that run, winning all those games, I mean, they were in the hunt, but they weren't really around. And then they win all these games. Yeah, they just miss out, but I mean, are they really substantially better than any of these other teams like the Rangers, like the Blue Jays? I don't think so. When I look at the Cubs, though, Cubs were in that the fourth seed or the fifth seed for a long time. Uh, we talked about it. I thought the Phillies were going to get to play them at home in the wild card in the first round,
Yeah.
but then they kind of just collapsed. It's going to be interesting for them. Like I said, I asked that question because it sucks, because now you have a Cody Bellinger who's coming up on a free agent year. It kind of seemed like most of the guys bought back in after that Stroman speech at the trade deadline, but again, you missed out in the playoffs now. We don't know what's going to go. I imagine Cody Bellinger gets some kind of bigger deal, multi-year deal. So I think it's definitely more of a letdown for the Cubs. But I like the Mariners, man. They're fun. That's why I asked, because I'd love to see that team in the postseason. Just that vibe, that stadium, the announcers, everything about the Mariners are just fun. So I think personally, I'd rather see the Mariners, but the Cubs, it's more disappointing for them.
Yeah, I mean, I weighed it back and forth, because when you look back into the beginning of the season, I mean, the Cubs, they made moves for the future. They signed Dansby Swanson. They get Cody Bellinger on. They did sign him to a multi-year, 2-year deal, but he's going to opt out. We all know that. But then the other moves that they've made, they potentially wanted to keep Stroman. They didn't sell at the deadline. They kind of bought in because they felt like they were in a good position to make the wild card. And at probably like July and even August and all the way up until early September, Fangraphs had them, I saw someone tweeted out, Fangraphs had them at like 92% making the playoffs as of like September 8th.
Yeah.
And then all the way up until yesterday, it went all the way down to 0. So looking at that, it's super disappointing, but I feel like if I'm a fan of the Mariners, I feel like it hurts a little bit more, because this team finally got to the postseason last year. They won over, I believe, 94 or 5 games. And although they did end up falling short to the Astros, who ended up winning the World Series anyway, this felt like this should have been another year where they took another step forward. And it seems like they took a step backwards again. And they had some issues at the end of the season. We talked about it with, we may have talked about it with the George Kirby thing, but if we didn't talk about it, everybody talked about it to death. Julio kind of going extremely cold when they needed him the most. That's probably the biggest reason why they didn't make the postseason, because they got off to a bad start. Their offense was awful. Their pitching has been good all year, whether it's the rotation or the bullpen. But whenever Julio's hot, that team's hot. Whenever Julio's cold, they just seem to not be able to hit. And when you're a best hitter, and we love him, J.P. Crawford, he was arguably their best hitter in the last 2 weeks of the season. That can't be. We've seen it. He came up in clutch situations, and a lot of people on social media were clowning him for that. Blaming J Rod for the reason why the Astros ended up winning the division. So it sucks for the Mariners. So I'm going to say it's probably more disappointing that they didn't get in, because I feel like if the Cubs say it's only disappointing for the Cubs now because they were so close to getting
Right.
in. But if you're looking at beginning of the season, I think the Cubs at the beginning of the season, if you told them they were just going to miss the playoffs, they'd be like, okay, that's a good that we won then,
Right.
like, because we
Building
didn't
block.
go all in. But now we know, hopefully we know what to do. But I think of the way that it happened. This is the other thing. I feel like the way the Cubs fell
Yeah.
just hurts more, because they could have clinched if Seiya Suzuki just caught that fly ball. And I know they were up 6-0 and then they blew it. So that means there's a bunch of stuff that happened. But at that moment, I mean, if the Cubs don't make the playoffs next year or the year after that, this is going to be a play that they look at. Is going to play. That's going to be what he's remembered by for the next couple of years. And it sucks to say, because he's actually one of the best hitters on that Cubs team. So, and they have a lot of question marks now, because it's definitely not looking like Cody Bellinger is going to come back. It definitely looked like he's played well enough to get, and we talked about before, to get that big multi-year contract, just because of what the years he's had prior. And then what he did this year was just remarkable. So, but I'm still going to say the Mariners on this one.
Yeah, it's when you look at the success from last year, it definitely makes sense. The Mariners, they made the playoffs, didn't have crazy runs or anything like that, but they tasted that success. You think I mean, it's not an aging roster. Definitely, they have some older vets, but they have guys, like Julio, that are in their prime right now or entering their prime. So they definitely looking at before the season or last year, that definitely makes sense. I was thinking more of the September collapse that
Yeah.
happened with the Cubs. That just sucks. But again, like you said, if you look at it at the beginning of the season, if you're one game out of the playoff game of the Cubs, you're pretty happy with that.
Yeah. I feel like both of them had a September collapse, because prior to September, we mentioned it when the Dodgers went into Seattle, like the Mariners were hot. I think at that time they won like 11 of their last 14 games. And then after they got swept in Seattle against LA, it seems like they just couldn't get back on that track from that. So, and then the Cubs, they kind of, I think they lost 11 games
Yeah, it was
in
something like that.
11 and 14 or something like that. So that's just, it seems like they both just kind of folded when they really needed it to happen. So, but yeah, I feel like the more we talk about it, I'm starting to just like go lean more towards the Cubs, just because of how bad it was in September. But I don't know. So either way, both teams, they don't make the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So super disappointing for them if you're a fan. Um, but both teams, they have a lot to look forward to next year. Cubs have a lot of young prospects. The Mariners are the same way. So on to 2024 for those clubs. But not on to 2024 yet is the teams that did make the wild card and did make the playoffs. And the wild card round does start Tuesday. The Marlins and Mets will not have to play on Monday, like we mentioned before. So they get a W with that. Similar to the Braves, only playing 161 in 2021. So it's happened before where the game could have impacted something a little bit, but it doesn't, because the D-backs couldn't do anything today against the Astros. But like I said, the wild card round changed last season, going from 1 game to 3 games. We should all be familiar with that now. So it is a 3-game series that kicks off Tuesdays. They have not announced the starting times for any of the series yet. I imagine they would have them posted probably tomorrow. But it's going to be on ESPN and I think maybe ABC for some of them.
Yeah.
But definitely a lot of matchups that are interesting this week that coming up. So just to reading them off, we had the seeding finalized today. We have in the National League, Well, I'll go with the American League because that's first. So in the American League, surprisingly, the Rangers don't win today, so they don't win the division,
Mhm.
and they will have to go travel to Tampa to take on the Tampa Bay Rays. And then the Blue Jays, they finally clinch a spot today, even though they lost to the Rays, but they will take on the division winner of the Central, which is the Twins. So out of those two matchups, what are your reactions to that, if any? And what's like surprising, and who's the most surprising team out of that? That if you looked at the beginning of the season, that you didn't think was going to be there today.
It's hmm, it's definitely going to be interesting. I think the biggest storyline of this is Texas, man. It's like you were right there from being, where Houston is. You're one game from being the 2 seed, and now you have to travel to Tampa, who's the second best team in the AL in terms of record. It's just really, really bad play down the stretch, and just didn't do a job. Um, Honestly, the last couple months, but that's a surprise. Um, to be honest, I'll keep saying it because they don't show anything. I think the Twins might be the worst team out of all these things. If you told me at the beginning of the season that the Twins would be the 3 seed, I would never believe that. I would never have believed that. Um, Honestly, it's good. It's gonna be fun. I mean, playoff baseball with the Blue Jays is always fun, and then Tampa Bay and Texas is definitely going to be fun because Tampa Bay plays everybody hard, um, but it's kind of underwhelming for me. Nobody really, no teams that are really super exciting. That I'm looking out to watch for. I will definitely be watching the Orioles and the Astros when it gets to that second round, but I mean, Tampa Bay is always fun to watch, but it's just a lot of monotone games. Just see how it goes.
Yeah. It could have been a lot more interesting
Right,
if the Rangers won today.
right.
That's really what I was looking forward to because I really wanted to see. I mean, everyone like the Twins are interesting because their offense really isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
In September, when they got Rice Lewis back and all these other hitters, they did start hitting a lot better. But what defines the Twins has been their pitching this season, and the combination of Joe Ryan, Sonny Gray, and Pablo Lopez has been what essentially won them the division this year. I picked them to win the Central, but not because they were by far the best team, like one of the better teams in the American League. They
Right,
just happened to be the most complete, stable team in the American
right,
League Central. And it was pretty much down to probably either them or the Guardians, and then the Guardians kind of slew down. So they default get the third seed. I believe every other wildcard team has a better record than them. Maybe the Blue Jays are close to them or something like that, but I think technically the Twins have the worst record in the American League bracket. But that's just what they're the team that came out of the worst division in baseball. You never know what's going to happen because they have the pitching to make a run. It just depends on if their offense can carry that with
right.
them. And that's probably the biggest question mark. But I really wanted to see the Astros, not because I hate the Astros or anything like that. I wanted to see them kind of have a different road to the World Series if they were going to get there.
Right, have some resistance.
Yes. And to not only lose the division after winning the World Series, but then to be if the Rangers won today, they would have been, and the Astros lost, they would have been the sixth seed,
Right,
um, which would have been really interesting to see them going to Minnesota and go up against some really good pitching because it seems like their offense is pretty 50-50 this year. And it would have been a nice change to see a team that we're so familiar with being so dominant to kind of have to have some adversity and battle, all the way up. But now it's kind of, I mean, I look at that bunch of teams and I feel like the Rays probably strike me, even as injured as they are, they still strike me as the best team out of
right.
that bunch. And if you're a Rangers fan in the playoffs, we've talked about it already before. Everybody's already talked about it, and it's a huge reason why they didn't win the division, and it's their bullpen.
Yeah,
And I do not trust their bullpen at all going into the postseason, even if they have a lead, because they've shown no matter how many runs it is, whether it's 4, 5, maybe even more, that it seems like they cannot hold that lead.
right.
And Tampa, they're gonna play around. They're gonna mess with you. They unorthodox way of putting a lineup together, pitching. I mean, I feel like they should be favored not only because they have a better record, but just because I feel like the Rangers just have too many red flags.
Right.
Um, but without the Astros kind of in the mix there, or even the Mariners, how you mentioned how they're like a nice young fun team.
Yeah.
It's very like I'm gonna have like a lukewarm reception to
Right.
watching these games. Like if you put in Seattle and say if it was a Seattle home game, the way their fans and how their young roster is, like when they're celebrating this, it's I'm not gonna see that. I mean, seeing the Blue Jays get in
That's
there,
right.
but it's not gonna be at home.
Right.
Like if it
That's what
was
I was
at if it was at the Rogers Center, it'd be different. We've seen how their fans react to these types of games. So I'm pretty disappointed with how this bracket is looking for the wild card for the American League. I know you are already going to agree with me that when we get to it, the National League just seems like the more interesting one, and I imagine most viewership is probably going to be focused on those games. So when they announce the game times, I assume the Phillies, Marlins, and they're going to probably get the prime time along with the D-backs Brewers possibly. So, um, but other than that, the American League, whoever gets out of them, like you mentioned, the division series for whoever wins these rounds, it's going to be interesting because we got a lot of nice teams in there. The Astros, they automatically get that bye off, so because they won the division, and then the Orioles, the first time in the division series since 2014. So it'll definitely be interesting once the American League comes up.
Yeah, I was. That's why I was gonna say the same thing as you, man. Like it's. I was hoping that the Toronto games would be in there because at least you get a little vibe from them. But yeah, it's just not a lot of. It's just not a lot of passionate fan bases or the real like. I wouldn't say established teams, but like big market teams. Like when you go into the NL bracket, which we're about to talk about anyway, you have Miami and Philly. Philly is one of the biggest markets. They're probably gonna get the primetime game just because of that. Milwaukee and Arizona, people are going to want to watch that game because it's going to be close. It's going to
Yeah.
be close. So it's just I don't know. I think it's like in the AL we're just waiting for the ALDS. I feel like.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a stat that was tweeted out a couple days ago where this is like the first time in like 20 years that the Yankees, Cardinals, and Red Sox aren't in the playoffs at all.
Right.
And that's a big issue with TV viewership. So um, I know we don't want to see the Yankees and these big market teams always in the playoffs every year, or at least huddling up this wild card round, which is kind of tailored toward the smaller market teams.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's definitely impacting the American League. But moving on to the National League, where we're going to make our bread and butter for our reactions, we got a lot of good matchups, I think, just because of the players that are on these teams and the pitching itself. And I'll just get started with the D-backs and Brewers. It was looking like the D-backs were going to be heading up to Philly, but they can't take care of business against Houston. And Miami just went on a nice winning streak to get not only a wild card berth, but to also jump them in the standings for that wild card. So it's going to be D-backs, Brewers. That starts on Tuesday. Winner of that will face the Dodgers, and then Marlins and your Philadelphia Phillies. They're going to be attacking each other at the bank. So, and the winner of that faces their rival, the Braves. So, got an NL East gauntlet for these next 2 weeks, apparently. So, I guess whoever's writing the storybook for the MLB is getting a nice.
Nice cut. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
That's what I say. It's just completely different story over here, man. It's like I'll start with the Milwaukee and Arizona because obviously it's a less attractive series. Milwaukee is definitely good, but they're not leaping down above Arizona. Their pitching's been real good, but I mean, they don't. Like I said, they don't have a place where you go and you just die. Like you go to LA and you're like, damn man, this shit sucks. Like this place is loud. You go to Philly, this place sucks. You go to Milwaukee, man, you're like, oh, it's just another game. I think that's going to be one of the more competitive series. And then of course you have Philly, Miami. Miami always will play Philly hard forever and ever, even though they lost Miguel Rojas. It does not matter. But you have Philly, who's been pretty hot. I mean, 7-3 in their last 10, even after losing like 3 straight to the Mets because we didn't care. And then Miami 6-4 in their last 10. beat out the Cubs to get into that last or the fifth wild card spot because Arizona folded as well. But yeah, man, it's just gonna it's nice. I like that you brought up the prime time because we definitely should have the prime time at least Tuesday night. But yeah, man, it's definitely gonna be way more fun watching the NL games over the next week.
Yeah, and like I mentioned when we first started the live stream earlier, the National League has a lot of surprising teams in it that made the wild card. We had Baltimore winning in the American League East, but in terms of wild card, it was kind of predictable in the American League. Like I feel like the teams that are in it is like what was kind of predicted at the beginning of the season, but nobody really had the D-backs making the playoffs, at least not this year. And I can't think of a single soul that predicted the Marlins to not only be above the Mets but also make a wild card. So that's whoever betted on that's making a lot of money. But I think that's what makes this year interesting. And the Marlins, they play the Phillies tough, but just the way they got there and the amount of injuries they've had to not only their offense, like Jazz Chisholm's missed a bunch of time, but they also don't have their ace, Sandy Alcantara, this year, who was having a bad year, but he's out for the year. So they're going to have to piece it together. And we mentioned it last episode. This is the first time that I think besides 2020, this is like the third time they've ever made the playoffs in a full season. So it's good for the city of Florida or Miami to make the playoffs, and they can make a run if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
They have some of the clutch hitting that you look at with these types of teams, and we've seen before that you don't always have to be the best team to win, or at least make a decent run. The Marlins could do that, but the Phillies, that's a tough task in the playoffs, in prime time. And these Phillies players, like you mentioned, they dropped the series to the Mets. But I told Phillies fans, like, this series doesn't even matter because no matter how many games they win or lose, they were already destined for the fourth seed where they're at right now. So all they really need to do was just be healthy and go into the postseason healthy. So um, but I really like the D-backs Brewers series just because of the pitching matchups is that we're going to see. Like this is going to be pitching heavy because both of these offenses are, for lack of a better word, pretty bad. They're not. They have a couple guys that could beat you. Corbin Carroll's definitely the X factor in that series, and then other. I mean, the best hitter probably for the Brewers this probably since the trade deadline has been Mark Canha, who's been a really good trade acquisition, but also Phillies legend Carlos Santana. He's probably also been the other good hitter, good hitter on their team. But it's definitely something with all these series that we'll get into a lot on our next episode, which will be coming before the wild card series starts on Tuesday morning. But I just think the playoffs, this year we got a lot of good teams, especially in the National League, and it's definitely going to be a dogfight.
Yeah, I know we weren't going to go too long, but before we wrap up, one thing, like you touched on the pitching matchups, that's going to be the biggest thing I think, especially for the NL. I don't know exactly, but for the AL, but I know because the Diamondbacks were possibly playing the Phillies, Gallen can't go till game 2. Pretty sure Merrill Kelly's lined up to go game 3, so they would have to win at least one of those first 2 games. The Marlins are starting Jesus Luzardo and Braxton Garrett. So, like you said a year ago, it was Alcantara and Pablo Lopez, and now it's that. I think that's going to be the storyline of these beginning rounds. We'll talk about it a little bit more next week, but I think the pitching matchups in these short rounds and the teams who did their job and get in the playoffs early to set up their rotation, I think that's the teams that are really going to, win these series.
Yeah, compared to last year, I feel like a lot of the playoffs, like seeding and the like everything was set like
Yeah.
almost a week before the year was over. So the wildcard teams had time to get their rotation set. The division winning teams had like that whole week off to get theirs set. Because I mean the national or the Phillies Cardinals, they both pitched their best pitchers, and it seems like the Diamondbacks, the Astros probably to an extent, and the Rangers and these teams that still had to play all the way up until the second or the last day
Right.
are kind of at a disadvantage with at least pitching lining up. So it'll be interesting to see, especially like how you mentioned the team like the Marlins, because um, who's the guy, the rookie that they had this year who was really good? That
Yuri Perez.
yeah, everybody on Twitter was wondering where he was at, and I think it's because his scheduled start was technically supposed to be that game 3, like if you do that 5-day rest. So I assume the D-backs and the Marlins are hoping just to at least take game 1 or game 2 to force that game 3, so to get their ace um, on the mound. But it'll definitely be interesting to watch for sure.
Yeah, man. It's that's kind of what it's going to be. I think you these teams who already have their rotation set up, most of them have two starters at the top of their rotation that can go win them games. You steal one of those games, either game 1 or game 2, you get to game 3, you never know what's going to happen, man. Game 3 of the NLDS, Noah Syndergaard pitched last year, so like you never know who's going to be there for that third game. And again, winner take all games, most exciting baseball you can find. So I'm ready for it and I'm hoping for it.
Yeah. Well, that'll about wrap it up for the live stream. I didn't want to do anything too long. Just wanted to get a brief overview of the postseason and the final day of the regular season. It's over, Now the real season begins for the teams that are left. The like we mentioned, the wild card begins on Tuesday, and we will have our next episode, episode 10, wild card preview out on Tuesday morning on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So be sure to look for that. Be sure to follow the Diamond Club on Twitter at the Diamond Club Zero. And if you want to follow me and Jake as well, you can always see our work on there. But that'll about do it for this live stream. Be sure to be there on Tuesday.
Sure.